The Athletic.
The race is on, and it was Max Verstappen versus Lando Norris in the Austrian Grand Prix until their late race collision handed a first win in over 18 months to Mercedes and George Russell. But was the penalty deserved? And what's the fallout from their clash? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me with all the answers are Scott Mitchell-Malm and Mark Hughes. Scott, how are you doing? How's Austria? Always a great place to be, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, Ed. It's definitely one of my favourite races. Very scenic. I think we talk about that probably every time we come here. There's probably a Sound of Music style reference or something akin to that. It's a good track for racing. So it's just it's also a track that's just really fun because you can see so much of it. It just reminds me of old school kind of kart tracks that I grew up around. And yeah, particularly fun and special weekend for me because it's my dad's 60th birthday this year, and he's been at the race this weekend. And on Thursday, I was able to get him into the paddock, show him around, introduce him to a few people. He was massively starstruck, just snapping drivers left, right, and centre as they were going about their media activities or just standing around in the paddock. So it was nice to be able to share something behind the scenes with him.
Excellent. Any such stories for you, Mark, or just a standard Spielberg weekend for you?
Well, it is it's probably the most beautiful venue that we come to in terms of scenery. But yeah, I did have a family connection. My brother Warren is coaching at the McLaren Formula 3 guy, Alex Dunn. And so he was with us. Not often we're at the same race, but yeah, nice to see my kid brother.
Hopefully then that means that you're going to have your brother or something at Silverstone, Ed.
I don't think I'm going to have anyone at Silverstone, unfortunately. I'll just have to put up with the likes of you two. But that's enough for me. The race family, as we like to say. But anyway.
That could not have sounded more disingenuous.
It's very, very hard. I'm not very good at saying things like that. But of course it was well meant. But anyway, let's get into this race because there's a huge amount to talk about. And Scott, for a long time, this Grand Prix looked like it was going the same way as the sprint race with Verstappen leading from the start. Didn't even have Norris bothering him, unlike in the sprint race early on. Then it came alive when Verstappen had that slow left rear wheel change and fell into Norris's clutches at the final pit stop. We've got to start with lap 64 in the collision. Can you talk us through it and apportion blame, please?
Are you asking me to explain how the race was lost?
Something like that, yeah.
Excellent, borderline on Mark's level. Yeah, it was building up to that crescendo. The battle between the two of them. It was shades of Imola, but with obviously a lot more of the race still to go, and crucially on a circuit where you can actually overtake. So it was obviously critical for Max to try and keep Lando at bay on the run up the hill. Before they finally came together, we'd had a couple of dress rehearsals for some kind of contact. It was interesting to see how Norris was kind of reacting to how Max was defending, because the first time Max looked like he moved in the braking zone, it completely just killed Norris's attack dead. So then I think the next time Norris went for it, he just sent it up the inside and was never getting it stopped. But it was a good bit of keep catching Max unawares, a proper, right, if I move at this point, can he react? And the answer was no. But at that point, it's braking too late. So you got the sense that Norris was just kind of feeling what that battle was about. And when he then tried to catch Verstappen, I really liked that Norris kept trying different kinds of moves. And this time, obviously, went to the outside, dived nice and late. He can't do anything at that point. He's in a straight line. He's basically up against, if not running on the outside curb slightly. And you can see there's one camera angle in particular that shows Max's drift across from where he is initially when he sets his defence to the left into Norris's car, causes the damage. So the decision, I think, was the correct one in terms of apportioning blame to Max. I don't think Norris could have done anything to avoid that incident other than not try to win the Austrian Grand Prix, and then I think we'd all be sat here being quite critical of him for not giving it a go. So it was a shame that it came to that, but the other thing to mention is that battle was about to be ruined anyway by a 5-second penalty for Norris. So in a way, in terms of things to talk about, is it probably a bit better that they came to blows on track before we could just say, oh, what a shame this was spoiled by a penalty?
I guess so, although there was briefly for about a lap the possibility that Verstappen would get a 5-second penalty which would neutralise Norris's penalty, because he'd been off the track as a result of Lando running wide, essentially doing that dive bomb. And so Max was off the track to avoid contact, fully all four wheels off the track, and rejoined still ahead. And Norris was arguing, well, he should give that place back because I was still on the track and I was ahead at the apex. So there's a possibility that the stewards may have seen it that way as well and imposed a 5-second penalty, which was would have made us able to, forget all the silly theory and get on with just enjoying the battle again. But that prospect lasted, as I say, for only that lap.
And obviously the collision put both out of contention for the win and allowed George Russell to win for Mercedes. But although the actual clash that got the penalty, the 10-second penalty when Verstappen, Norris was on the far left of the track, Verstappen moved across, there was nothing Norris really could have done about that. So whether or not you want penalties awarded for anything, ultimately Verstappen getting that penalty you can't really argue with. But the interesting question was the wider battle in terms of the moving in the braking zone that you alluded to, Scott. But Mark, what did you make of that? Was this kind of old Verstappen coming back, do you think? Yeah,
this was Verstappen in extremis. This is what when you put him under real pressure, this is how, and it's not a panic thing, it's quite calculated. He just, there is no acceptable outcome other than he wins, and so he will, as we know, if we've seen against Lewis Hamilton, Sebastian Vettel, Kimi Raikkonen, they've all been on the other side of it. He will, if necessary, he will run you off from the inside, or he'll turn in from the outside, or he will hover around in the braking area and then make a move. In fact, they've had to rewrite the regulations as a result of some of those Verstappen traits. So, I think he was doing what you'd expect him to do. I don't think it was anything outrageous, but if you're going to have a set of sporting regulations, he was probably just over the line a couple of times with them, and quite a long way over the line with the final one.
Yeah, I think I don't think he did anything. I don't think he did anything utterly egregious in isolation, but I think the problem is that line is drawn somewhere. He tests it more than any other driver, so he strays across it, and then he takes a big step across it from time to time. And I do think that final move, which is ultimately what leads to the contact is an example of that. Mark alluded to it. There's a belligerence in Verstappen when he starts to lose control of a race, he starts to lose control of wheel-to-wheel combat, I think. It doesn't result in anything. It's kind of like it's calculated, but kind of automatic and reactive in a way. He has been emboldened through years of driving this way, and for most of the time getting away with it. And if he cops the odd penalty here and there, it doesn't really matter because most of the time it works, right? And so if that's your natural driving style anyway, and you're basically encouraged to keep doing it because it pays off more often than it doesn't, he's not going to suddenly stop, is he? So this is basically the sum total of everything that's come over the last few years. Andrea Stella said it was specifically things like 2021 against Lewis Hamilton that kind of encouraged this, but it's not just that. It's everything big and small around it. And it's not that you can't blame Verstappen for driving this way, but you can't expect him to suddenly eradicate all the things we saw a few years ago when those situations arise again, because it's almost like he's conditioned to be this way, both through him as a driver and through how it's been policed previously.
Yeah, exactly. You can only play the rules the way they're applied, and that's what Verstappen does. And it's not a Verstappen-only problem by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think there's a wider question mark about on-track discipline and how people race, etc., that F1 has got in a bit of a mess over the past 5, 6, probably over the past 10 years pretty much, but I won't get into that now. I'll be here all night. But it was interesting, wasn't it, the reactions, because I don't know about you, Scott, but from what I saw, because Verstappen was initially annoyed in the car, but then after the race, he was a little bit more careful. He complained a bit about the strategy. He defended the moving in the braking zone, but he didn't really defend the actual incident itself, whereas Norris seemed to be willing to put the boot in a bit more. How did you see it?
Yeah, Verstappen on the final move that led to the contact, Verstappen was kind of shifting the blame onto Norris a little bit and kind of acting like I was surprised that he appeared out of nowhere. He was. There was a beautiful kind of hypocrisy to how much Verstappen was complaining about Norris's dive bombs and sort of being a little bit out of control under braking and being unpredictable. I thought that was it was said sincerely, like as well. That's what made it quite amusing. But I would say
textbook Formula One driver, though, isn't it? They all do.
No, absolutely. But I would say, Ed, if you're looking for one response that sums up who was in the wrong and what they got wrong, it was Christian Horner describing the third incident, the one that led to the contact, as a racing incident. And if Horner describes something that Verstappen's involved in as a racing incident, you know he really thinks that Verstappen's to blame, because if he thinks it's anything else, he will rampantly defend Verstappen. So I think that tells you all you need to know.
Yeah, absolutely fair. I think it's also worth asking, Mark, what we learnt about Norris in this, not just from this battle, but also from the sprint race, where obviously he made that brilliant dive bomb pass on Verstappen at turn 3 and then threw it away with a fairly elementary racecraft error by just not covering the inside at turn 4. So what do you make of Norris's on-track racecraft this weekend against Verstappen?
Yeah, it was patchy, wasn't it? As you say, that was quite a naive move, which lost him with the retaliation by Max and also another place to his teammate Oscar Piastri. I think this has been building for a while, and I think as the McLaren has become more competitive, it's sort of pulled Norris into a zone where he knows he needs to be more focused and step up, and he knows how difficult an obstacle he's got in the shape of his friend Max Verstappen, and the fact that they're friends is just probably making it more complicated for him as well. And we saw a little hint of he realizes he's probably going to have to get aggressive. We saw a little hint of it at the start of Barcelona last week, didn't we? When we had Max onto the grass, but it just came a little bit too late to make that force for Verstappen to back off. So I think Lando's expecting to have these sort of races with Max, and was anticipating the sort of move Max was going to pull. But I think it was just, if it hadn't have been here, which as you said earlier, it was actually only triggered here, that it happened here because of that slow pit stop at the end for Max. But if it hadn't have been here, it would be somewhere else. It would be somewhere down the line this year. The McLaren is competitive enough and Lando is quick enough that it's going to pull them into a zone of conflict, these two friends. And so it'll be interesting to see how the friendship evolved.
And I think this weekend will have been super valuable for Norris, because you mentioned there a couple of times, Mark, there's a difference between, I think there's a difference between what Lando expects and anticipates in battle against Verstappen and then actually really living it, because the last few weekends there have been glimpses for him, haven't there? This is how hard it is to beat Max. This is how hard it is to be at 100%, nail those crucial moments like Canada with the safety car, with Barcelona with the race start, the sprint race, making sure that you see that move out after you've done it. But what he hadn't experienced up until now is that ruthlessness from Verstappen firsthand. Now he has, and Norris was much more aggrieved than Verstappen was. In fact, Verstappen's done this loads of times. He's clashed with everybody. He's kissed and made up with everybody.
Yeah. It's very natural for Max. There's no poison in it. There's no badness in it. This is his interpretation of what racing is.
Yeah.
But other people don't see it necessarily that way. But you know that if you're going to go wheel to wheel to Max, you have to get used to it.
So I really think this would have been valuable for Norris in that regard. And I do wonder, because I suspect they'll have spoken by the end of this evening. Post-race, Max was like, now's not the time for me to make up with Lando. But Lando made it really clear he felt the onus was on Max to clear the air over this. And if you put in the onus on Max to be the one to hold your hands up and say, sorry about that, we go again next week, you're not really going to get that very willingly, unless their friendship does change things slightly. But I think it means that when we go to Silverstone next week, when we race in the future, these guys go wheel to wheel again, there's going to have to be there'll be a bit more steeliness in that battle. It will change things. It might not be dramatic, it might not be super obvious, but it will change things. And I can't wait to see what this means for coming races and future seasons if these guys are going at it wheel to wheel, because I love the fact that we saw today Norris won't just stand down. He'll try different things. He's happy to go wheel to wheel. He fought fire with fire, and sometimes I think that is the way you have to go do battle with Max Verstappen.
I think it's great. Ultimately, you've got slightly different styles, some proper needle and rivalry. This is what we want in Formula One. I think so many people get behind one driver or the other. I just like seeing these battles, and sometimes you will have clashes. Great to see this big talking point in this season. It's just getting better and better. Right, Mark, there is still some space for the traditional how the race played out question. So let's just wind back to the start. Can you take us through how Verstappen and Norris got into that position and how Russell was in place to pick up the pieces?
It's as we've seen for the last few weekends, Verstappen and Norris are the fastest two guys in the place, or the fastest combination of car and driver in the place. And the Red Bull qualifying advantage was much bigger than it had been in recent races, and it was beginning to look like this would be reverting to early season levels of domination on race day. And we saw the sprint race didn't really knock that theory into touch either, because he won quite comfortably and could probably have won more than the 4 seconds he did win by. All he had to do was get himself out of the irritating DRS early attacks that he was getting with the help of DRS, and once he got himself out of that range, it was comfortable enough to pull away. And the first couple of stints in the race, it again looked like they were on course for a comfortable victory. He pulled out 6 seconds by the end of the first stint and had 7 seconds by the time he came to change for the second time, and it looked as if he was just pacing himself back to whatever pace Norris was doing behind him. And so, it was, I think, Red Bull's most competitive race probably since early season, probably since Japan, China time. Not quite as dominant as that, because the McLaren is much better now than it was then. But it was comfortably Red Bull's weekend in terms of performance. And the McLaren was comfortably the second best car. So George did a good, solid, polished job in running third, but he by the time they had the incident, George was 12 seconds or something like that behind. But that was comfortably clear of everyone else, and that's just where the Mercedes was this weekend. He did a very good job. He made Lewis's race look a bit scrappy. Lewis had to surrender a place to Carlos Sainz in anticipation of being asked to give a place back from something that happened on the first lap. He then ran his car over the curbs, damaged the floor, which he'd done also in qualifying, in sprint qualifying. So, a bit of a scrappy weekend from Lewis, and he was sort of 20 seconds back by the end. But George, very, very calm, polished performance, and it would have been a worthy third. And then it just all came to him. So, a worthy recipient of a bit of good luck.
Scott, we mentioned in passing Verstappen's critique of Red Bull. He wasn't very happy with the strategy. He wasn't happy the first stint, went on a bit too long, so he got caught up in traffic. He obviously wasn't happy with the 6 odd seconds lost in that final pit stop that made all the difference. Do you think that's a fair criticism? Because he did have it all under control. Other than that, and he wouldn't have been there to clash with Norris, but for particularly that pit stop blunder.
Fair criticism, probably. I mean, is an accurate observation. They ceded control of this Grand Prix in quite a dramatic way. I don't know really. Like sometimes,
it's just stick and wheel. I mean, it happens, isn't it? You get sticky wheels. Is that somebody's fault?
Exactly. So it's not like it's criticism. That's what I mean. It's fair criticism insofar as if what you're saying is we had the race in our hands and then we needlessly put ourselves under pressure. Like, that is true, but I think the problem with Max is I think it's part deflection because he was involved in the controversial incident and this helps sort of point the finger at someone else. But I think it's also, we've seen this before, when he feels that Red Bull's not holding up its end of the bargain, he can be quite petulant in his comments and quite needly, which is a difficult thing for me to get out. And I think we saw that again today. Like it was other things he criticised as well. Like he was complaining about how long he was left out for the first stint. He was complaining how long he was left out at the end of the second stint. And then his irritation was basically, I got left out and I was struggling, and then they screwed up the pit stop anyway. So then I was under pressure. But the only reason he gets left out in those scenarios is because if they bring him in, he comes out in traffic. And he doesn't have that read of the race.
Yeah.
Sometimes it just feels a little bit like, just back what the team are doing on that side. I get that he's annoyed at the things that went wrong, but sometimes there are moments where you just go, that's how it happened. He was still in a position to win that race after all of those.
Yeah,
so he contributed as much as the team did in terms of the downfall.
Yeah, in terms of that second stint, his gap over Norris was unchanging. It was hovering at around 7 seconds. So he wasn't under any threat by staying out. Secondly, you're very vulnerable to the safety car coming at just the wrong time and losing the other race if you come in unnecessarily when you've got a big gap over the other guy. And thirdly, he would have had to. He's going to have to switch to mediums for that final stint, and their range was limited to about 30 laps. So he couldn't come in as early as he wanted to anyway, because they had to go onto the mediums, because the hards just they lasted, but they weren't very quick, and hence he was struggling. But that was just how it was for everyone. So, without that full picture, you need to know all those things to know whether you are being held out too long.
It's just
I don't think he was.
It's just top driver moans because he hasn't had the result he wants. Like these guys are, the top guys are the most intense. They're the most focused on. They hate it when anything slips up. It's really easy for them to brush aside their own errors. It's a lot harder for them to. That win as a team, lose as a team mentality slips quite easily when you're annoyed. And there were a lot of factors that came together to basically piss Verstappen off. And we know what he can get like in those scenarios. So it's not the first time this season that he's dug out Red Bull a little bit for things that haven't been perfect. And it won't be the last. This is just part of that intense character. It is part of what makes him so great. It's part of what makes him a pain in the arse if you're in the same team as him sometimes.
Right, Scott. Let's talk about George Russell. How significant is this win for him, given the slight question marks that have been hanging over him in some areas?
Yeah, I think I don't think it directly addresses a couple of the things that we've talked about on this post-race podcast a few times in recent races. It doesn't do things like the errors in Canada for something like that. What I will say is that this showed just how good Russell can be as a team leader for Mercedes. You wanted a car there to pick up the pieces. Which car was it? It wasn't the second McLaren. It wasn't either of the Ferraris, and it wasn't the 7-time world champion in a Mercedes. It was George Russell. So, okay, was there some assistance along the way in the form of things like Piastri's slightly harsh penalty for the track limits offence in qualifying? Yes, but Piastri went beyond track limits. Okay, McLaren contests that it wasn't emphatic. I would argue that the fact that he dips a wheel on the gravel on the outside shows that he probably was over the white line on the left-hand side of the car. Russell didn't do that. The other drivers didn't do that, so they didn't get a penalty. So I feel like Russell was like borderline perfect this weekend, and you think quite highly of his performance all round, don't you, Ed?
Yeah, I will look into it even more. But yeah, I just think it was really well executed all the way through. The sprint component as well. Just very, very rounded, well executed. Nothing really wrong. I haven't finished driver rankings yet, but he's a strong contender to be number one. He'll certainly be up there. I'll work that out shortly.
Do you think it was his best weekend of the year? It felt like it's really easy to say that because he won, but I just think if he'd finished third in that race, that's a better third than his third in Canada by
100%.
Definitely. So I think it was.
Yeah, 100%. And perhaps the consistency and the improvement of the car has helped him to deliver that. And Mark, it's worth mentioning, this is further validation of the Mercedes progress. We talked about it after Canada. We talked about it after Spain. And as George Russell said, they couldn't have imagined being in the position to pick up the pieces from this sort of incident around Bahrain time, or even a few months into the season. This sort of opportunistic victory would have been impossible.
Yeah, and I asked one of the engineers there, I said, what's the difference? Because it's the car's sort of, solidly competitive now, but it's still, a tenth or two off the absolute front pace, just as it was in Barcelona. Why was it really bang on the pace in Montreal? What's the difference? And he said, I think we were performing at the same level. I think it was just Red Bull was struggling more in Montreal. So I think what you're seeing is ours is that's about where ours is, and the Red Bull sort of flits up and down around it, and presumably the McLaren too. But they say they've got upgrades coming and before the summer break that will bring some performance, but obviously, as ever, it depends on what everybody else brings. And it just needs that final push to bring it properly into the mix. Where it sounds maybe odd saying that after it's just won a Grand Prix, but it was going to be a distant third. We seem to have got past that stage where they're wildly fluctuating and they don't know where they are.
There was a reason why Hamilton said after qualifying 24 hours before this, that when you see a gap like they had to Max in qualifying here, that win feels further away. It feels like quite far away. Now, obviously, you can't rely on circumstances like this, but and Max isn't going to be that far up the road at every track this season, even when the Red Bull is sorted out. But that is where Mercedes kind of thought they were this weekend. They're better, but they're not right there. So to do this, to have a real win, if you can call it that still feels like a couple of upgrades away.
Yeah, and obviously it's also worth noting that Russell did have to make sure he kept Piastri at bay. Piastri was recovering. Sounds like he had a little bit of damage somewhere on the car after the first corner, but he got close after climbing from 7th, but wasn't ultimately a threat, so that's positive as well. Lewis Hamilton finished 4th, an okay weekend for him, but Russell was the main man for Mercedes. Let's talk briefly about Ferrari, Mark, because Carlos Sainz finished 3rd, although the bad news is that would have been 5th, but for the collision at the front. Leclerc had a pretty frustrating weekend, all sorts of problems in both components of the weekend, the sprint and the main elements. 11th in the race after that first lap damage. What have we learned about Ferrari's struggles?
That its upgrade has taken them into bouncing territory, so it's sort of confirmed what Barcelona suggested. They were on the cusp of that this weekend again, and so that they to get out of it, you have to compromise a little bit, not be so greedy on your downforce. But the way to properly solve it, of course, is to get better control of the suspension of the car and the ride of the car at the super low ride heights at which the big downforce is delivered. So the update has brought more downforce, but that downforce has taken them into that territory where the bouncing is. So you could say, well, why not surrender the downforce? Well, that's effectively what they do by raising the ride height, but there's no point in doing that. It's not a racing mentality. You know that the potential is in there because the downforce numbers are telling you, so you work out a way of being able to run it like that. But until they do, they will be relying on circuit characteristics coming to them. So the sort of slow circuit, mechanical circuit, stop-start circuits, they will still be absolutely front rank at, but anything a bit with the fast corners and the aerodynamically demanding corners, and they're a little bit off at the moment.
And they're trying to push through an upgrade for Silverstone. Carlos Sainz was saying that could improve matters a little bit, but some work to do for them. Basically the 4th best car, close, but not really where Ferrari would have expected to be. Scott, Haas, we haven't talked about them too much recently. They've traditionally gone well in Austria. This is a great result. Nico Hülkenberg 6th, Kevin Magnussen 8th. So why did they rise to the top of the midfield here?
It's a very good question, especially considering where they were in the first half of the weekend. They didn't feel, and Hülkenberg certainly after qualifying had felt that better reflected sort of where they felt the car was. They were probably the biggest beneficiaries of the new sprint format that reopens Parc Fermé and allows you to make those changes after the sprint race, because the Haas wasn't terrible. I think Magnussen was perfectly competitive in sprint quali, but it was more difficult. Hülkenberg in particular was a lot less comfortable in the car. So
Magnussen, actually, I have to say Magnussen was really strong in the sprint element of the weekend. Best possible qualifying position and result. If I driver rank the sprint component, Magnussen would probably be number 1. Really, really good from him.
Excellent. Don't say that. You'll give yourself more work to do. You'll be asked to do rankings mid-weekends for the sprint. So I think basically what happened is I think they just were able to refine elements of it so that both drivers could get something out of the car for the Grand Prix portion of the weekend. And I have a sneaking suspicion that where that car was sort of in the sprint would have been hard work over a Grand Prix distance as well. But really this kind of just reflected like what that car is capable of. And it's actually quite impressive with Haas, because we've seen before, okay, yes, they've gone well here in previous years, so maybe it's a similar stage of the season as what they've done previously. But they're not drifting away in that midfield fight. They're holding their own as they bring parts to the car, and I don't think we've ever seen that in Formula One before, which I think is quite encouraging. Obviously, they benefited from certain circumstances today, the clash between the top two, and Sergio Perez being all out of sorts with a car that seemed damaged from lap one, and Perez had a stinker of a weekend, but he wasn't as bad as that Grand Prix made him look. That was obviously damage exacerbated. But Hülkenberg, borderline heroic what he did on the last lap to make sure he beat that Red Bull, because even a damaged Red Bull, I think probably it was Hülkenberg that finished sixth there, not a damaged Red Bull putting Perez in seventh. So getting that result, huge for them, massive. Like that's given that Alpine have been picking up a little bit of form recently and just tossing up the odd point or two here and there, that could have been something that in the second half of the season Alpine build on and then catch and overhaul Haas. This kind of haul here could be massive for Haas in the championship. It's the difference between them being, just clear of the real tuggers in the championship standings at the moment and consolidating themselves as, a real leader in that midfield group.
Yeah, and 12 points for them this weekend, having scored only 7 in the races. Before that, Mark, we should briefly talk about RB or VCARB, as I fear there's an increasing tendency for them to be called. They started the weekend still scratching their heads about the upgrade that was introduced in Spain. Ricciardo did manage to take 9th in the Grand Prix, though, and there did seem to be a step for the serious business of the weekend after the sprint. So did that confirm progress is being made, not just for the car, but actually for Ricciardo as well?
It's difficult to say with Ricciardo because he's been so up and down. It's not the first time this year he's looked really good. It's probably the third time. But, on previous occasions, it's followed by another weak performance. So let's see, but it's encouraging. In terms of the progress RB's made from the misstep of their upgrade in Barcelona, it seemed that part of the reason for that is that it just didn't work with the wing that they had, and they were trying different variations of the wing to try and sort of energize the floor upgrade, and they were mixing and matching parts. So I don't think they've fully nailed it yet, but they at least are on the right track. But they that status of being best of the outside the top 4 teams, which they pretty consistently were before the upgrade. That's definitely some way off in the distance at the moment.
Tsunoda was suggesting that he didn't have any of the Barcelona upgrade parts on his car by the end of the weekend. Mm-hmm. So he did also say that he didn't end up too far away from Daniel. So I wonder if that meant that after the sprint, again, Parc Fermé, blah, 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 that mix and match that they had, I wonder if that veered more towards pre-Barcelona spec and basically not the upgrade. And then Tsunoda just didn't have any of the new parts, because I specifically asked Yuki that after the race, and he said emphatically he didn't have any upgraded parts on the car. And I had heard earlier in the weekend that basically there's numbers from the track in Barcelona just didn't match what was happening in the sim. So that's a little bit worrying, because one of the things that propelled them so nicely last season was that constant progressive effective upgrades in the second half of the year, which then also helped power their good start to the season. So I kind of need to get on top of that, because as we were saying, if Haas are performing well and Alpine are up in their game, it doesn't matter that Aston Martin are still in no man's land. That they've got other rivals in that fight, to nick those final points places.
Let's talk about Alpine now, and we can be positive about Alpine because, while we like being critical of them, Pierre Gasly was 10th, and that's 4 consecutive races in the points for them. Ocon was in the mix as well before he shed that rear brake duct winglet. So does this all confirm that Carlos Sainz should sign for them and all is great?
We both looked at each other like...
Not sure about that. I think the long term of that team is not really clear. It's not crystal clear at the moment. But the existing core of the team, I think, are doing a good job in engineering out the problems that they found with it, the car that they were given. And I think the trackside people and the development people are doing a really solid job, which you would expect, because that team has never lost that ability. That's always been a very, very strong engineering group and race group. But in terms of the other elements required for longer term success, it's very much up in the air at the moment, and we've got the extra uncertainty with whatever whatever Flavio Briatore's been hired to do. So, yeah, let's wait and see.
It's that long-term element is key. If you were going to ask, if Sainz was signing for a team to drive for the rest of this season, you'd say Alpine, because that car definitely looks better than the Williams and the Sauber now. It would actually do Alpine a favour, because he could step in, replace Ocon, and then they wouldn't have any of these silly little squabbles, because they were at it again, weren't they, Ed?
Yes, yeah, there was got a bit of griping. I was quite surprised in the end that when Gasly passed Ocon on the outside at turn 4, there wasn't any contact, but actually that was nice and clean. But yeah, there was a little bit of irritation. Gasly was giving Ocon the hurry up when he couldn't get past Alonso for a bit, and then they had a few close calls at turn 3 in particular. But yeah, encouraging for Alpine. But it seems, Scott, can you give us the very quick update on Sainz's future? Because you did a good story about how Alpine figures in this that's worth briefly touching on.
Yeah, so basically, a few weeks ago, Sainz's choice had basically boiled down to Audi or Williams. They still were in dialogue with the likes of Alpine, but that weren't really a serious contender. As Mark alluded to, Briatore's come in. He's sort of shaking things up a little bit. One of the things that Renault is considering, as much as they don't want to confront this publicly, is what to do about an engine. Do they continue with their works program or not, or do they try and go for a Mercedes customer deal? I think Briatore has floated to the Sainz's. I know someone has, that Mercedes deal might be possible. Sainz is now put pause on making a decision, because it looked like he was on the brink of signing for Williams. That has sort of frozen things on the Sainz side again. And now Williams is sort of thinking, okay, well, maybe we need to progress with our alternatives. I think Audi are still sort of hanging around to see what Sainz will do. So, yeah, there'll be a video on the race's YouTube channel this week, sort of diving into that in more detail. Or, as you said, Ed, there was a story that went up on the race website on Saturday that people could look for. The headline, if you just Google something along the lines of Mercedes Alpine prospect now key to Sainz's F1 2025 choice, something along those combination of keywords will find you the article you're looking for.
And a very good article and story it was. Two of the other teams, I think Aston Martin and Williams, you can just listen to what we said after the last race in Spain for their struggles. Sauber a little bit worse, but still going nowhere. So there's not much to talk about on those. Those were the teams down at the back. And yeah, Alonso clobbering Joe was quite clumsy from him, so he's been fairly lacklustre of late. But yeah, needing to see some progress from some of those teams for them to be more of a factor and warrant talking about a little bit more on our post-race podcasts. Well, as per tradition, the final part of the podcast is dedicated to questions from the Race Members Club. For more on how to become part of the Race Members Club and all the benefits of doing so, which includes question-asking privileges on this very podcast, click the link in the episode description or search for us on patreon.com. Mark, first question from Gavin Cameron. Why was Max so slow after the last scheduled stop? It was a slow stop, but the car seemed to change after that.
It was on used medium tyres compared to Lando's new medium tyres. That's worth about a tenth of a second per lap. And they came up to temperature faster, and that got him into DRS range. And as soon as you're in the DRS range, he was, he couldn't escape. So yeah, partly tyre, partly DRS, partly tyre warm-up characteristics. I don't think it was slow. It was just in that set of circumstances, it wasn't able to stretch its legs.
And that lock up on the outlap wouldn't have helped either on the way into T4.
Yeah.
That was I thought he was lucky to keep it out the gravel, to be honest. But you could see there was a good slow-mo shot of it shortly afterwards. A little bit of damage on that right front tyre. So that probably, it looked like Verstappen was really struggling with the rotation of the car in the final stint. So might have been a factor. So all these little things add up.
One from Jasper Pendlebury for you, Scott. Question on the stewarding. How were they so comfortable sitting on their hands when Norris got close to Verstappen? Max was clearly moving reactively under braking, and the black and white flag was nowhere to be seen. And when it finally came to tears because Max kept going unpunished, he was handed an inconsequential slap on the wrist. What's going on in race control? Am I just being partisan? And is it time for the drive-through to make a return? And on a related note, Luke Kelly asks, what is the line between hard racing and legal defending manoeuvres? Very broad question there, but the quick version, I guess.
Yeah. The second point I answer very quickly with that broadly gets brought down to, like, do you make another change of direction? Do you make more than one change of direction anywhere? That's a no-no, and also moving in the braking zone is a no-no. And obviously, if you clatter into somebody, then that's probably taking things a bit too far. As for the first part of the question, I think it's because the first two, while I thought it was pretty clear that Verstappen was moving under braking. He says he wasn't. He claims he was doing the movements before he was braking, which if that's the case, then he is braking extremely late into turn 3. I think it just wasn't clear cut enough for them. And there isn't, okay, you've got that black and white flag, but again, if they don't, in that situation, I think you either think he's doing something wrong or you don't. So my suspicion is if they hadn't come to blows in the way that they did, that move at the top of the hill at turn 3 would have been a black and white flag. That would have been a proper, this is the only warning you're going to get. So I suspect it's as simple as that. I think they do try and let hard racing go, and as I said, there's certain ways to judge it. Not sure they completely got it right here, but I think we're at least a step removed from 2021, where I feel like we sacrificed all elements of hard but fair and let them race in the pursuit of just pure entertainment. And it was a little bit anything goes back in 21. I don't think we're there anymore.
Question I'll take from Steve D. Red Bull were keen to avoid going too hard on Lando Norris in post-race comments, almost the same as their non-committal answers about Checo's performance. Their line was, "That's racing." Is this because they know Max was at fault for the incident deep down, or was it down to their long-term interest in Lando, or both? No, they are interested in Lando Norris in the longer term, but no, I don't think it was anything to do with that. I think it was just they knew they were probably banged to rights on the collision, so they just, as Scott said earlier, trotted out the "that's racing" line, which I think was probably the sensible move. Mark, a question from Ollie Emerson, who says, despite the large tyre deg, there seemed to be a surprising, for me anyway, lack of undercuts. Any thoughts on why?
I think the gaps were just too big, weren't they? Certainly at the front. We had, Max pulled comfortably away from Norris pulled comfortably away from George pulled comfortably away from Carlos Sainz. Lewis was falling back from Carlos Sainz. I just think that the way that it fell, the gaps just weren't there. The undercut only works if the gap's small, so it was just that. I think there was quite a big step in between each car.
And the next question for you, Scott, from Andrew Heyer. Can Russell make his way into the title fight this year? And if not, is he ready to try next year?
I don't think so. I don't think the car's going to be quick enough. I think you could have argued if this race had gone different, if Norris had won and gained a bunch of points on Verstappen, Norris is the driver you're probably looking at as the most likely to force his way into contention. I just think the Mercedes is coming from too far back. It's boding quite well for 25. I think there's probably more than one team now thinking actually we might be able to be in a good place for 25 now. But for 24, I think McLaren's the only one that's sort of looking consistently enough of a threat to do something like that. And obviously the perverse outcome of today is, even though Verstappen's the one that got a penalty for the incident with Norris, Verstappen actually extended his championship lead. So, I fear this is only going one way, and Russell won't be the person to gate crash it if anyone tries to.
Yeah, I think it's 127 points behind as well, so that's pretty insurmountable. A question I'll take now from Andreas Hjalmarsson, who says, how good was Nico Hülkenberg's race? 6 in a Haas, clearly my driver of the day. Please discuss. We've mentioned it briefly, but a few things that were particularly good about Hülkenberg. As we referenced, holding off Perez, did very well there. He had to manage the tyres sensibly and deploy the pace over the stint sensibly, because they made a fairly early pit stop to go onto the hards as well, so that was significant. There was a little bit of aggro between him and Magnussen in terms of who was doing managing and who wasn't, but they sorted that out, so that was very good. And yeah, I just think Hülkenberg's been driving really, really well this season, and it's good to get a big result. He's had something like 5 11th places, and some of those have been really, really good drives, but just in a car that wasn't there. But the Haas was very strong this weekend, so yeah, good work from him. Mark, a question from Nick, who says, could Lando Norris have taken the fight to Max in the sprint if he hadn't lost out to Oscar Piastri? He seemed the faster McLaren.
I think he probably was marginally the faster McLaren, but no, I don't think he had the pace to hang on to the Red Bull. The further on it went, the stronger the Red Bull looked, actually, which is the reverse pattern of what we've seen in recent races, where the McLaren was better late in the stint, and was again actually in the Grand Prix. But I think in the sprint, no, it wasn't. I think Lando was hanging on to it because of the DRS, and as soon as they started fighting, that was Max's opportunity to get out of that DRS range and show the real pace.
A question for you now, Scott, from Jack Aitken. I love the idea of the Red Bull Ring's new gravel strips, but my hope was that they'd eliminate the need for lap deletions. What are the thoughts on their success? And Villa Nikari asks, what's the meaning of gravel traps if track limits are still an issue even with them?
So I really liked the solution that they came up with for 9 and 10. I don't think it's perfect. It's not the kind of thing that would work at every single track because different track layouts require kind of different solutions realistically. The bit that I thought was slightly strange here was that the idea behind 9 and 10 was that it was physically impossible to go beyond the white line and then stay on the track. So it was irrelevant. You couldn't.
It should be self-policing
exactly.
because you're already on the gravel losing time.
Exactly.
It doesn't really matter.
Where that didn't apply was turn 6 and the Piastri controversy, because as Piastri proved, you could dip a wheel on the gravel there and go faster. But that's because they hadn't done that specifically for this event. And unlike 9 and 10, it turns out you can just about fit an F1 car.
So you just need to move the white line a little bit.
Yeah, or the gravel trap slightly closer. That would be a really good solution. I'd be very happy with that.
Ideally, you'd want it so that it's self-policing. As soon as you dip the wheel in the gravel, it's irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly. And if you get to that point, then you keep the white line rule because then it applies to all the corners that doesn't have gravel. But then you wouldn't have the controversy in these corners because once they're in the gravel, they're slow anyway, so it doesn't matter that the lap time gets deleted.
And related to that, a question from Stuart Coulter. I'll take the mini gravel traps at turn 9 and 10 appear to do a great job of reducing the number of track limits offences during the weekend. Will we see these being introduced to other circuits? A simple answer and a complicated answer. We should see them introduced to other circuits. I can think of a number of corners where they could be very valuable. Will we see them? I think it's going to depend on cost because they might be small, but they do cost a bit to put in. And of course, there's the need sometimes to take them out again. I saw Simon Patterson, our esteemed MotoGP correspondent, tweeting that they'll have to take them out for MotoGP at the Red Bull Ring. So it'll come down to cost, but I think these are a really good idea and we should see them elsewhere. Mark, a question from Lachlan Cowan who says, how good was Oscar Piastri's drive and was a win really on the cards?
It was good, and had he not had the qualifying penalty, he arguably would have won. I think if he'd started from P3, where he qualified, he would presumably have been somewhere around being first in line to benefit from the Verstappen-Norris incident. So yeah, very good. He had to really put the work in and made good passes on Hamilton, Sainz, and yeah, he was quick, and he stayed out of trouble, but was quick, and I think that was a very good platform. Generally, his performance this weekend is a very good platform after his difficulties in Barcelona.
Scott, a question for you from Mark Watts. Was the Williams mass recruitment announcement a last-minute event as they were expecting to unveil Sainz for 2025? Another public move to convince him to sign since they were expecting him to have done so by now? Or both?
There is a chance that the timing of it was to help with the argument, but this announcement itself hasn't been created just to further some Sainz pitch. If you remember at the Miami Grand Prix, James Vowles was in the Friday press conference there, and he actually said in his pitch, I think it might have been in the context of Adrian Newey. It might have been in another answer, but I'm sure it was in that. He actually did say there that they've made lots of technical hires and they're hoping that they'll be able to announce them soon. So that was, 7 weeks ago? Something like that. Mm-hmm. So Williams have been not sitting on the announcement, but they've been preparing to announce something like this for a long time. Whether it was a complete coincidence, I don't really believe in those in Formula One. It might have been that they thought, actually, now's the time to do it because we're trying to make this Sainz pitch. And obviously there is this Alpine Mercedes thing brewing, which makes Vowles and Williams a bit wary that they might miss out on Sainz. But no, I think that was more just reflecting and emphasising the work that they're doing off track, because obviously this is the other reason for it, I suspect, timing wise. It's been a bit crap on track recently. So a nice reminder to the world that they are trying to move things in the right direction.
And also the James Vowles revolution. He stepped through the door in late February last year, wasn't it? And so a bit of a period of working things out, then you start pushing on recruits, and quite often 12-month lead times before you get them through, so it's perhaps no surprise that you're starting to see people come through the door at this sort of time. And the final question is from Sean Murphy that I'll take. Looking at Norris's final track limits violation at turn 3, which earned in the penalty, do you think penalties should be disregarded for track limits violations which are as a result of a mistake from which the driver doesn't obtain an advantage, e.g. lockups, etc.? I think, I'm not a huge fan of it for that particular thing, certainly not after a collision or something. You can also say, though, that you're already on a black and white flag, so you should be careful. But the real solution is make track limits natural, and it's not an issue. You don't have to do these penalties. That's the real answer. So, I think I'd agree. Ideally, they should be avoided. That's the easy way to do it. Well, thanks very much, Scott and Mark, for your insight. Head to therace.com. Loads to read there. Or other podcasts like Bring Back V10s are well worth listening to. And also have a look at our YouTube channel. Lots of videos. Scott referred to one he's got in the works for later in the week. Well, it's a triple header, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the British Grand Prix.
The Athletic.